This level is quite beautiful as far as visual design is concerned. Looks gorgeous, but the scope of the level, on the other hand, brings some things into question. We know from the dialogue earlier that Adabat is a small town, a small village that holds only 4 people. So why is it so big? Now don't get me wrong, this is definitely a nitpick. The locations in 3D Sonic games have always been larger than life and kind of surreal in how bombastic they are. Take what was that level in Sonic Adventure? I can't believe I don't remember. Oh yeah, Speed Highway. I was trying too hard to think of a clever name when the name of the level is just Speed Highway. But take Speed Highway in the original Sonic Adventure. The roads on that highway are absurd. There was no way that any car, futuristic or otherwise, could ever traverse those. In addition, everything in that level is just so large, impractically large. It's a fever dream version of what someone might imagine a big city to be. I'd say that the further Sonic games went into development, the more they tried to make their locations seem less, strangely cartoonish, less surreal. But for the longest time, that was an important part of Sonic games' visual design. Like, even in Sonic in 2006, take Crisis City, for example. That city is all skyscrapers. There's not a single building in that place that isn't a skyscraper or attached to a skyscraper. And the skyscrapers in that level are so enormous, too, beyond any practical reason. They are gigantic. It might as well have been called Skyscraper City instead of Crisis City. Sonic Heroes definitely had the most surreal and larger-than-life locations out of any of the 3D Sonic games, but I think that was absolutely intentional. Sonic Heroes had a lot more in common with traditional platforming video games than the other 3D Sonic titles. I don't think it's out of the question to say that the final level, Egg Fleet, where you're on top of Eggman's giant airship, is a lot less surrealistic and bizarre than the rest of the levels in the game. So that should give you an idea of how crazy the visual design was in general for that particular title. Compared to that, Sonic Unleashed stages are downright photorealistic. And keep in mind, I'm not saying that the more surrealistic, larger-than-life stages are better or worse. I think that both methods of tackling stage design are perfectly fine and both have their benefits. For example, in Sonic Unleashed, the slightly more realistic tone of the level design makes the hazards feel more genuine and grounded in something that might actually occur. For example, when running through the streets and across the rooftops of Spagonia in Rooftop Run, the day stage, you can get the impression that people could actually live there when you're not platforming in it. And then in Sonic Heroes, you're platforming across a giant bingo table, collecting giant bingo chips that are like twice the size of your body. I think both of those are very appealing for very different reasons, and I don't really mind which of the two I see. It does bring up something that people don't often bring up about Sonic games though, and that the world of Sonic is anything but consistent. And I don't just mean visually consistent, even though that's the biggest offender. It would be more accurate to say that the only thing consistent about Sonic games is the characters. For example, the purpose of the Chaos Emeralds is explicitly stated in Sonic Adventure. Sonic Adventure's narrative, if nothing else, is about exploring what the Chaos Emeralds actually do and what happens when they are removed from their purpose. But in Sonic Unleashed, the Chaos Emeralds have an entirely different purpose, and it's never really explained how or why or whether the two purposes are connected in some way. There are also at least 4 separate ancient gods of destruction in Sonic's world. There's Dark Gaia in Sonic Unleashed, there is Chaos in Sonic Adventure, and then there are Solaris and Iblis in Sonic 2006. That's 4 separate gods of destruction for one world. And I suppose in Generations there's also that time monster. Anything you see about Sonic's world building, you can expect to be completely forgotten by the time the next game rolls around. The only things you can expect to be consistent are the character's personality, motivations, and their portrayal in the games. I was downright shocked when Shadow the Hedgehog remembered enough about previous games to form a narrative.
How do you like that, huh?
Like, honestly, when you think about it, it's incredible that in Shadow the Hedgehog, someone remembered where everything was from Sonic Adventure and Sonic Adventure 2 and decided to use that as part of the narrative. But I suppose part of the reason for that is because it was necessary for Shadow's character arc. Without a lot of the pieces of Sonic Adventure and Sonic Adventure 2, Shadow's character arc couldn't have been completed successfully. So I guess they had no choice but to remember where everything was. This is the most boring level in the game, by the way. I always thought it was a little unrealistic that in 3D Sonic games, people got upset whenever Sonic slowed down at all. Because people seem to have an idea of what Sonic should be about that was never explicitly stated or even explicitly shown by the series. Even in the first 3 Sonic the Hedgehog titles, the original 2D ones, the game was never purely about speed. It was, for all intents and purposes, a 2D platformer where speed sometimes played a role in the gameplay. But somewhere along the line, and I'm not entirely sure where, people decided that Sonic should only be about speed all the time. And that's unrealistic for a lot of reasons, but the one that I'm most chiefly concerned about, and have been proven right in my concern, is that people tend to complain when a game is too short. And if you use all your assets and budget making a bunch of levels where Sonic goes really fast, your game is going to end up short. The biggest complaint I recall with Sonic Generations is that the game was over too fast, and I'm not sure what people expected when they finally made a game entirely about speed like everyone whined for. It isn't as though Sonic Team was cheaping out either. There were a decent number of worlds, and you could play as both classic Sonic or modern Sonic in both, giving each world at least 2 versions, 2 unique sets of stages. The short playtime associated with the game is simply a result of making a game that goes that quickly. Making the player character go faster doesn't automatically decrease the number of graphical assets and budget you require. In fact, it's probably a nightmare trying to balance a decent playtime with a game that goes that quickly when most of your graphical assets and budget have to go to details in stages that are over in a couple minutes. There isn't going to be an 8 to 10 hour Sonic game where Sonic goes as fast as he does in Sonic Generations and there are no alternate modes of gameplay. I understand you want Sonic himself to go fast, that's reasonable. But to ask Sonic to go fast 100% of the time or his games to be about speed 100% of the time is incredibly unrealistic. That being said, there is a gray area here. Although I do definitely support alternate modes of gameplay in Sonic games, the alternate modes of gameplay need to be unique, interesting. And I think this level is the best example of how exactly not to create an alternate mode of gameplay for a Sonic game, and by extension the Werehog stages as a whole. The alternate modes of gameplay in previous 3D Sonic games have always been uniquely unsolicited. People didn't ask for them most of the time, but they were always unique and interesting. There's nothing quite like the treasure hunting stages in Sonic Adventure 2, for example. Tails and Eggman's shooting stages are also quite unique. They feel something like a rail shooter, but with free movement and platforming mixed in. Kinda interesting. What I'm getting at here is that even though these alternate modes of gameplay were never really about speed, they always tried to bring something good to the table, something special. The Werehog stages in Sonic Unleashed are the most boring, bland, been there, done that kind of alternate gameplay mode I could possibly imagine. There is nothing unique or special about what happens in the Werehog stages in Sonic Unleashed. I actually quite enjoy the Werehog stages in the 7th gen version of Sonic Unleashed, but I can still admit that they have nothing really special or unique about them in comparison to the other alternate gameplay modes in previous Sonic games. They certainly could have attempted to use the stretchy arms to make the gameplay far more unique than it actually is. There's a lot of potential there, but all it does in this game is extend your attacks slightly beyond the average range of your average beat-em-up protagonist. How are the Werehog stages so depressing? How are the day stages so good? What went wrong?
How do you like that, huh?
Oh hey, here's a Werehog level I actually don't mind. Let's go ahead and play this one without me getting all depressed. Before we get to the actually interesting part of the level though, I think it would be neat to point out that the progression of the Werehog stages is even more evident in the Adabat levels. How you're moving from one location to the next until you reach your ultimate destination. Granted, part of this can probably be attributed to the fact that there are 4 Atabat Werehog stages when normally there are only 3 per continent. Anyway, this enemy formation actually isn't so bad. There are some hovering enemies like the bees close to the ground which are actually hard to deal with, and then you have wizards offering support, and the flying enemies up above which fire electric bolts which will stun you, and sometimes they electrocute themselves, making them impossible to attack for a short period. Nothing outstanding individually, but at least there was an attempt to make the enemies work together to give them some kind of chemistry for once, as opposed to most of the other enemy layouts which do no such thing. At least, not too many yet. We're nearly to the interesting part of the level, but first, hey look! A hazard. It wasn't really worth anything, unless you were stupid enough to jump straight upward. But I guess it was a hazard. And hey, this section isn't all that bad either. I like the idea of hurling these weaker hovering enemies into the sniping flying enemies. It's kinda good. Is it challenging or anything? No. But it's not dreadfully boring. It's entertaining for the time period that it lasts. I think they spawn a few too many hovering enemies, but maybe that's just in case you missed your throws a bunch. So do you recall in the Ice Temple level, I said it would be really cool if I could platform across that scaffolding over a bottomless pit, instead of what it actually was, which was incredibly safe. Well, here you go. Here's just platforming across scaffolding over a bottomless pit. Granted, it's still not as interesting as what I had in mind. But you know, this is fine. This is actually something I would expect the platforming in the Werehog levels to be used for, and it looks good. It's still slightly too rudimentary for my taste, and I feel like the stretchy arm platforming should be mixed up better with the standard platforming. For example, it's basically just here's a stretch of standard platforming and then some stretchy arm platforming. But this section is still a lot more memorable than most of the other ones have been thus far. If you could just make me switch between the two kinds of platforming a bit more rapidly, I feel like that could have been a real winner. But it's kind of over now. You did hear me correctly before, by the way. There are 4 Werehog stages in this location, so you have one more after this, but there's some things I like about that one as well. And I won't run out of stuff to talk about. Unfortunately, the rest of this stage is the same really basic, boring platforming that we've grown accustomed to so far. But there were at least a couple things about this one that were kinda cool.
How do you like that, huh?
Welcome to the final Atabat Werehog stage, and right at the start there is something that resembles an exploration of the stretchy arm platforming. You may not have noticed before, but you can actually shimmy across a ledge from above or below, and this hazard makes good use of that. And additionally, Sonic moves differently depending on where you're standing on the ledge. If you're standing above the ledge, then Sonic shimmies kind of like a normal platforming protagonist and moves relatively slowly. But if you're hanging below the ledge, then he uses his stretchy arm to move much greater distances at a time. The difference in control is slight, it's true, but it's enough to notice when you're platforming past a bunch of spikes. You can stop Sonic much quicker when he's above the ledge than below it. So hey, that was neat. Unfortunately, it's going to be a little bit before our next piece of interesting design, so let's talk about something else again. Of course it's going to be Sonic related though. In a previous video, I brought up 3D Sonic scoring systems, and how they've mostly been the same across all 3D Sonic games, having 3 separate factors. However, things were the most different with the original 3D Sonic game, Sonic Adventure. It did technically have a scoring system, but not a rank system. You didn't get letter grades based on your performance. So instead of ranking the player was given additional missions to perform which were more difficult than just getting through the level. For example, one mission might state get a certain amount of rings and then make it to the goal, or make it to the goal in a certain amount of time. And unlike the ranking system in most 3D Sonic games, these missions weren't as obvious on the surface. You didn't get a score tally and have a D grade pop up and then think, man, I could do way better than that. Instead, it would just say, Mission C completed, and you wouldn't know what the fuck that meant, so you'd keep playing the game. So the mission system, although I consider it something of a replacement for the ranking system, was probably just intended to give people something extra to do after they finish the game, and not an indicator of how well the game is being played. This would most certainly explain a couple of things. For example, after finishing Emerald Coast's final mission, which is to reach the goal in under 2 minutes, I had no idea how the average person was even supposed to accomplish it. So let me briefly detail the strategy I used. Keeping in mind I didn't look up any guides, and this was the only way I could find to finish the level in time. I first catapulted myself on top of the bridge at the start, skipping the bungee rails entirely. Consistently spammed the spin dash by smashing the B button throughout the entire level. Used this vertical boost pad to veer myself entirely off the main course and skip past a huge downward ramp. And just generally jump around absolutely everything I could. You could imagine my surprise when much later I looked up exactly how someone was supposed to do this normally, and I just found people doing the exact same thing I was. The spin dash spamming, skipping the bridge, leaping over that huge section of level with the downward ramp, all of it. And at first I was just so utterly baffled as to how anybody was supposed to figure something like that out. The more games I played, mainly beat-em-ups though, the more I learned that developers certainly aren't above pulling things like that. And just because Sonic Team would never try something like that now, it doesn't mean they weren't crazy youngsters way back when. The reason I bring all of this up is because occasionally I see some people complaining about the routes you need to take to get S ranks in certain 3D Sonic games. But none of them are anywhere near as bad as Mission A in Sonic Adventure's Emerald Coast stage. This isn't meant to downplay the criticisms of people who think that some of the S rank paths are too hard to find or anything like that, but it's why I personally think that every other S rank I've gotten in a Sonic game is kind of cake in comparison. Some of the S-rank requirements in Sonic 06 can be brutal, for example, sure, but I know what I'm doing wrong. If I'm not going as fast as possible, I just need to find another pathway that goes faster. If I am going as fast as possible and still not getting the S-rank, I just need to kill more enemies or pick up more rings. You can always tell what you're doing wrong. You may not know how to fix what you're doing wrong, but you know the general direction you should be headed. Then again, I guess because of Sonic Adventure, I often look for absurd shortcuts in other 3D Sonic games. I suppose, in a way, Sonic Adventure changed the way I played Sonic games, and the way Final Fight changed how I played beat-em-ups. The difference is that the lessons Final Fight taught me, I can apply to most traditional beat-em-ups. The lessons Sonic Adventure taught me, I can only apply to Sonic games. Well guys, I have some good news and some bad news. The good news is that we're near the end of the final Werehog level. The bad news is that I've run out of shit to say. So I suppose I was very incorrect in that statement I made in the previous level. Well, I guess I do have an ace up my sleeve I've been saving for this particular occasion. Sonic Boom was an average video game. No, seriously, think about it. Compare it to any generic 6th generation combat-focused 3D platformer you can think of. It's pretty much the same game, right? It's pretty much identical to any 6th generation 3D platformer with combat mixed in. Of course, the biggest difference is that Sonic Boom is not a 6th generation 3D platformer. It is at least 2 generations removed from the 6th generation. But the game design, writing, and general sensibilities, they're nearly identical. It's not a terrible game. It's just really boring and average. There you go, that was it. That was my most controversial opinion. There will never be a more controversial opinion. And I've successfully taken up enough time that we are now at the second interesting part of this level. This is actually maybe my favorite part of the Werehog stages period in the entire game. We're in a big arena, made almost entirely of crumbling platforms, and we have to fight a bunch of floating enemies and wizards. We need to be careful of where we step the entire fight, and not only that, but the enemies have a mobility advantage we don't, because they don't need to look where they're stepping, they can float. This means we could either employ hit-and-run tactics by quickly moving to a crumbling platform, taking a few hits, and then jumping to the next one before the first one falls and plummets us into a pit. Or we could use the few bits of solid ground at the sides here, and make use of Sonic stretchy arms for something actually interesting. This is actually the only situation in combat I can think of where the enhanced range granted by Sonic stretchy arms is actually kind of important. It enables us to hit floating enemies hovering over an open pit, where otherwise we would have to go to them and plummet to our deaths. This is the kind of game design you might actually see in a beat-em-up I enjoy. It's basically a puzzle, but a puzzle where you punch things.
How do you like that, huh?
This boss battle is embarrassing, not just for the boss, but for me as well. You see, because I like this boss's visual design so much, and the boss's attacks resembled attacks from an actual good 3D beat-em-up boss, I tried to play the boss battle like an actual good 3D beat-em-up. The problem being that, in spite of outward appearances, this is not a good 3D beat-em-up boss. You can still just run straight up to him, smash the square button, tank every single hit, and you'll win the boss no problem. This is one of the few situations where I let confirmation bias get in the way of how I absorb a game's design. Because this boss's visual design just looks so nice, and his attacks seem, so good. They seem like they're good attacks for a good 3D beat-em-up. So I wanted it to be true, but it's not. It's not true. This boss looks flashy, but it's garbage, and you can beat it just by mashing the square button. Observe for the duration of this fight, where I slowly realize this, and my motivation drains to make the boss look good, to the point that I tank every hit, and just take the laziest route possible, and everything still turns out fine, and I still get my S rank. Bad boss, bad.
How do you like that, huh? Huh?